I have been asked, more times than I can count, what it was like to be there. People want me to say it was glorious. They want the clean version, the version where the capes snapped in the wind, where the weapons hummed with righteous light, where the good guys won because they were supposed to win. That's the version that's been filed in the official record, I'm told, framed and mounted somewhere in the rebuilt hall. A monument to the day the Convergence came and left empty-handed. I was not in the official record. I was a facilities tech, third grade, assigned to the Hall of Heroes orbital maintenance rotation. I mopped floors. I patched conduit. I knew where the coffee was and how to reset the environmental scrubbers after Captain Aaron accidentally vented a training room. I was not a hero. I was not meant to be there during anything significant. So when people ask me what it was like, I tell them the truth, which is this. It was the ugliest, most desperate, most terrifying 6 hours of my life, and the reason anyone survived is not because the heroes were invincible. It's because when they stopped being invincible, they refused to act like it. Let me tell you what actually happened. The day started as a party. Scarlet Cyclone was turning 78. I know that seems like an odd detail to lead with, but bear with me. Elia's Vane, Scarlet Cyclone, retired, the last surviving member of the original Hall founding roster, had been given permission to celebrate in the main assembly atrium, and I had been tasked with the setup, streamers, an actual cake, which I had requisitioned through 3 levels of supply bureaucracy. Folding tables that I hauled from storage in sublevel 4, while the station's gravity plating grumbled under my boots. Elias arrived 2 hours before the guests. He was a small man by then, thin in the way that old fighters go thin, muscle turned to wire and wire turned to something harder still. He wore his old suit, the crimson one with the gold piping at the shoulders. It had been let out at the waist and taken in at the chest. He didn't say anything when he saw the decorations. He just looked at the cake for a long time, then at me, and said, "You put 78 candles on that thing." "Tried to find room for all of them, sir." "Don't call me sir. I used to clean toilets same as you when I started out." He sat down. "Couldn't find enough candles anyway, I suspect." 78 was a compromise. I only had 43. He laughed. It was a good laugh, loose and genuine and a little ragged, the laugh of a man who had seen enough bad things that the good ones still surprised him. I liked him. I liked him immediately. The others arrived in 1s and 2s over the next hour. I had worked hall maintenance for 2 years by then, which meant I had seen all of them up close. Not the idealized versions, the real ones. Bren Callows, the Black Canary, leaving a cold coffee mug on every surface she passed through. Aldrich Mays, Captain Marvel, who was very polite and very large and always held doors. Zarin, the Green Lantern, who had a habit of floating 2 inches off the floor without appearing to notice he was doing it. Helena, the Huntress, who never said anything unnecessary and always seemed to be tracking the exits. The Flash, real name classified to someone at my clearance level, so I knew him only as Marcus, who arrived so fast the door had barely registered his approach before he was already at the refreshment table. Batman and Robin I had met exactly once briefly. They were visiting liaisons rather than permanent station residents, which meant the full weight of their reputation arrived before they did. Even among the others, there was a particular quality of attention when those two walked into a room. Not deference, exactly. Something older than deference. Recognition. Robin, young, red-tunicked, still carrying the look of a man who had not yet decided how much of himself to keep private, made a beeline for the cake immediately. Batman stopped at the threshold, surveyed the room the way I imagined he surveyed every room, and then did something that surprised me. He walked over to Elias Vane and shook the old man's hand with both of his. "Happy birthday, Elias," he said. "You came," Elias said like he hadn't been sure. "Of course I came." That was the last uncomplicated moment of the day. The Convergence's broadcast reached every comm system in the hall simultaneously at 14:03 station time. I was in the galley running a calibration check on the food processor when the screens lit up. All of them. Every screen in the building, from the main atrium displays to the tiny status monitors on the maintenance terminals, showing the same image. 7 of them, seated in a low arc like a council of something that had decided it on the table. The one in the center I will describe as best I can, knowing that no description fully captures what it was like to look at Mordrak. He was tall, nearly 3 meters, and draped in something that was either a robe or a living skin. I genuinely could not determine which. His face was mostly human in configuration, which made the wrongness of it worse. The eyes were too still. The mouth moved in ways the jaw should not have permitted. He spoke across every electromagnetic frequency simultaneously, and the sound of his voice in the room had a physical quality, like pressure behind the ears. The others in the arc I will name by function, because their species names are not translatable without equipment I don't have. Weather Wizard was the atmospheric manipulator, a tall, thin being with 6 fingers on each hand, and a weather control rod that looked like it had been grown, not manufactured. Sinstro I knew by reputation, a humanoid defector from a peacekeeper corps, his yellow spectrum ring built to counter green ring technology specifically. Savannah was the one that looked most human, a small hunched figure behind enormous optical lenses, whose bionullifier research had taken 3 human academic institutions and a Martian university to even partially understand. Giganta was the war form, a combat-adapted species capable of mass multiplication under stress hormones, currently manifesting at roughly twice standard human size. The Riddler I did not recognize at first, a humanoid in green body armor, face obscured, whose function appeared to be tactical coordination and cipher construction. And Solomon Grundy was the thing I had no framework for at all, a mass of pale biomass organized loosely around a humanoid skeleton, roughly undead in the biological sense that a parasite-controlled corpse is roughly alive. Mordrak said, "We have placed a terminal device within your station. You have 1 planetary hour. Every clue to its location will be delivered through your own communication systems. We suggest you move quickly. We are watching." Then the screens went dark. For approximately 4 seconds, nobody in the hall moved. Then Batman said, very quietly to no one in particular, "They're already inside." I should explain here that I was not supposed to be part of any of this. My role in a security event was clearly defined in the emergency protocol docs I had read twice during orientation and not thought about since. Shelter in designated compartment 7, do not obstruct personnel, wait for all clear. That was it. That was the sum of my contribution. I was in compartment 7 for about 40 minutes. Then the environmental alert triggered for sublevel 3, which was my assigned maintenance zone, and the automated system flagged it for immediate technician response, because the emergency bulkheads needed a manual override code that only I had. And if those bulkheads stayed open, the ventilation failure would propagate to the atrium where Elia's vein was being escorted by a single canary who was already responding to a second alert in the opposite direction. And I looked at the screen showing the old man alone in the atrium, and I picked up my toolkit and I moved. I will not claim this was heroic. It was mostly reflexive and partly guilt, but it put me out of compartment 7, and so I was in the corridors when things started to go wrong. The first clue had sent the Flash and Green Lantern to the outer docking ring. The second sent Batman and Robin to the lower hydroponics bays. The Huntress and Black Canary were splitting the mid-levels. Hawkman and Captain Marvel were covering exterior hull positions, watching for an approach vector that, as it turned out, was not coming from outside at all. The clues were real. That was the part I didn't understand until later. There really were components of Savannah's device scattered across the station, and each clue genuinely pointed to a real component. It was a chase, a real one. The Legion was making them move, making them split up, making them cover ground. Making them. This was the part that mattered, making them thirsty. It was hot work. Moving fast through a space station in combat alert burns water. Every junction the heroes passed through had been equipped, at some point during the Legion's advance installation, with a micro-dispersal unit that released a tasteless, odorless compound into the local atmosphere. The bio-nullifier didn't need to be drunk. It needed to be breathed. I found out about this because I found one of the units. I was in sublevel 3, running the manual override on the bulkhead, when I noticed the service panel on junction conduit 7 had been tampered with. I know this because I installed that conduit panel myself 8 months prior, and I know exactly which screws I use and in what order. Someone had opened it and resealed it and used the wrong screw pattern. It's a small thing. The kind of small thing that only a person who puts something together cares about. I opened the panel. The unit inside was about the size of a fist, matte gray, with a slow amber pulse on a tiny indicator light. It was attached to the air circulation line. I did not know what it was. I knew it was wrong. I disconnected the air line on both sides of the unit, sealed both ends with emergency caps from my toolkit standard blowout prevention caps, not rated for bioagent containment but better than nothing, and called it in on my maintenance radio. No one answered. Every comm channel was active with hero traffic. I wrapped the unit in my outer jacket, put it in my toolkit case, and kept moving. I found 2 more before the hour was done. I didn't know then what I was preventing. I knew that the things didn't belong where they were, that someone had put them there quietly and deliberately, and that my job, my actual, mundane, unheroic job, was to fix things that had been interfered with. So I fixed them. The heroes found 5 of the 6 device components. The 6th was in a location that no clue pointed to, which was itself the clue, and Batman worked that out in the last 11 minutes and directed the Flash to pull the component manually while Green Lantern contained the energy release. I heard this over the comms while I was in sublevel 2, securing the 3rd dispersal unit, and wondering if the amber light meant it was still active or winding down. The answer, as it turned out, was still active. The device was disarmed at 15:02. I know because the station's alert tone shifted at 15:02, and someone on the command channel said, "Clear," in a voice that sounded like it had been holding its breath for 59 minutes. Then the Convergence forces boarded. This was not part of the announced plan. Mordrak had said nothing about a boarding. The device had been a distraction, not the primary action, but the setup for the primary action, which was that while the heroes had been running down clues, 7 separate breach points had been quietly prepared in the station's outer hull. And at 15:02, when the heroes were tired and separated, and had been breathing compromised air for the better part of an hour, the Convergence's enforcement units came through all 7 at once. I heard the hull breach alarms as 3 separate tones in overlapping sequence. I heard the Huntress's voice on the comm saying, "Contact, contact, Junction 14," in a voice that was completely level and completely afraid at the same time. I heard someone, I think it was Robin, saying, "I can't, something's wrong, I can't," and then cutting off. I found out later what was happening. The nullifier compound was in effect. For the powered heroes, the ones whose abilities were biological or energetic in origin, exposure had begun shutting down the enhancement pathways. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Zarin's ring was drawing on willpower he could no longer fully channel. Marcus was moving at 3/4 speed and getting slower. Maze could barely keep his transformation stable. The Huntress and Batman were unaffected in the sense that their abilities were trained skill, not biochemical augmentation. But even they were operating against a compound that was degrading fine motor function and reaction timing at the edges. The Convergence forces knew this because they had designed the protocol for exactly this. They did not fight like soldiers encountering resistance. They fought like a work crew arriving to clear a building they'd been told was already emptied. And they were wrong. I was in Maintenance Corridor 11 when I encountered the first of them. It was one of Giganta's war form units, a secondary mass form, about a head taller than me and considerably wider, moving through the corridor with the unhurried confidence of something that had been told the building was secure. It carried an energy lance. It did not initially see me because I was inside a service alcove, running a bypass on a power relay, and maintenance alcoves are not lit and I was not moving. It passed within 4 feet of me. I waited until it had moved past. Then I did the least tactical thing I have ever done in my life. I reached out, grabbed the power relay I had been working on, deliberately shorted the circuit I had just bypassed, and blew every light in a 40-meter section of the corridor. Total darkness. The warform stopped. I could hear it stop, the weight shift, the adjustment of breathing. It had good eyes, probably. Better than mine in darkness. But the energy lance was now also the only light source in 40 meters, and energy lances are not subtle. And when you are the only light source in a dark room, everyone can see exactly where you are and you can see nothing else. I was already moving by then. Not toward it. Parallel to it, along the wall, using the surface with both hands, moving fast and quiet toward the junction at the far end. I heard it fire the lance twice, both shots going wide and up, the bolts reflecting off the curved ceiling and burning themselves out against the far bulkhead. I made the junction, turned left, ran for 40 seconds, turned right, pressed myself into another service alcove, and sat there breathing through my mouth for a full minute before I trusted my legs again. My hands were shaking. They shook for most of the rest of the day. I learned to work around it. The battle for the Hall of Heroes lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes from first breach to full containment. I know the shape of it from the official record, which I read afterward, and from what I saw and heard directly. The shape of it is this. The Convergence forces had expected to find powered heroes at diminished capacity. Instead, they found powered heroes at diminished capacity who refused to behave as though they were diminished. Marcus ran at 3/4 speed. 3/4 speed is still faster than any living thing the Convergence had encountered in this system. He ran circuits through the compromised hull sections, and wherever he found breach teams preparing to advance, he moved through them before they could process the threat. He was not at his best. He was not required to be. He was required to be faster than everything trying to stop him, and he was. Zarin's ring was drawing on reduced capacity. He knew it. He adapted. Instead of full-spectrum constructs, he built small, precise things, a contained cage around Sinstro's ring hand, a focused beam through the energy core of 2 warforms simultaneously, a seal over a secondary breach point that held through 3 impacts before he had to reinforce it. He was not operating at peak. He operated at what he had. And what he had was enough because he did not pretend otherwise and waste none of it on tasks that didn't need it. The Huntress and Batman fought without any augmentation at all. They had been in corridors breathing the same air as the others. They were slower than usual. Their margins were tighter. Neither of them appeared to notice. Batman moved through Junction 14 with 2 Convergence enforcement units between him and Robin, and I know this because I was in the maintenance crawlspace above Junction 14 at the time, and I saw all 3 of them through the grating. He used the junction topology. He used the fact that the lighting was partially blown from an earlier exchange. He used the enforcement unit's own momentum and their unfamiliarity with the station's architecture, which was a thing Batman knew well and they did not. It took him 40 seconds. 40 seconds for both of them. He did not take a single hit. Robin retrieved the party supplies cart that had been sitting in Corridor 7 since the morning's setup, and used it as both a battering ram and a distraction simultaneously, which was either brilliant improvisation or a very specific piece of training, and I genuinely cannot tell you which. The Huntress found the communication node the Convergence was using to coordinate their 7 breach teams. She destroyed it. She did not have a weapon capable of destroying it in a single clean strike, so she used 3 different tools, in a sequence that I can only describe as methodical, and the communication node did not survive the experience. Without communication, the 7 breach teams were isolated. Without communication, Mordrak's strategic coordination fell apart. The breach teams defaulted to their individual combat protocols, which meant 7 separate tactical programs operating without coordination in a building whose layout they did not fully know, against people who knew every corner of it and were, by now, furious. I want to tell you about Helena separately, because what she did in Corridor 19 requires its own account. She had been alone in that section for 40 minutes by the time the Convergence's cipher unit found her. The cipher unit was Riddler. I recognized the green-armored silhouette from the broadcast, and he was flanked by 2 enforcement drones, and he was carrying a device that I later learned was a neural disruption emitter, a weapon specifically designed to incapacitate enhanced human nervous systems. Helena had been alone in that section because she had chosen to be. She had located a secondary communication relay the Convergence was using as a backup node, and she had stayed near it, waiting for someone to come and check it. She had been waiting 40 minutes in a compromised corridor with degraded motor function, and a crossbow she had jury-rigged from maintenance cable, and a section of structural strut, because the maintenance locker in Corridor 19 had been stocked with standard-issue equipment, rather than weapons, and Helena had spent 40 minutes turning standard-issue equipment into a weapon. The Riddler's unit found her at the relay. She let them get to within 8 meters, close enough that the neural disruptor would have connected if she'd been where they expected her to be, which was at the relay. She was not at the relay. She was above the relay, in the maintenance crawlspace. Yes, the same crawlspace network I had been using, and she dropped onto the lead drone from above and used its descent to break its power coupling. And then she put a cable strut bolt through the Riddler's device hand from a distance of 11 meters, and when he turned to the wall where she'd fired from, she was already somewhere else. The Riddler was taken down in a corridor junction 11 minutes later, confused, disarmed, and apparently uncertain how many opponents he had actually been fighting. The answer was 1. The nullifier's effect peaked around hour 3 and began to taper in hour 4 as the heroes metabolized the compound. This was known to be the case because Sivana's research, which the official Hall intelligence team had partially recovered before the incident, indicated the compound had a 4 to 6 hour effective window in standard atmospheric conditions. What Sivana had apparently not accounted for, and I find this remarkable, given the specificity of the rest of his work, was that Black Canary's vocal architecture was not classified in his research database as a powered ability. It was classified as a physical trait, a natural biological variation. It did not show up in the bionullifier's target profile. I heard the canary cry for the first time at the 2-hour 40 mark. I was in Corridor 31, and the sound came up through the floor grating, and I can tell you it is a sound unlike any other sound I have encountered before or since. Not loud in the way that weapons fire is loud. Loud in the way that certain geological events are loud. A sound that bypasses the conscious mind entirely and speaks directly to something much older. The 3 warform units in Corridor 31 below me dropped simultaneously. Their sensory equipment simply could not process and compensate for a sound operating at that frequency, at that amplitude, from that proximity. She made that sound 7 times in the next hour. I counted. I know because each time it happened, the station went briefly very quiet, and then the sounds of fighting resumed at a different pitch. Mordrak himself boarded at the 3-hour mark. He came through Breach Point 7 alone, which should have been impossible given what Breach Point 7's reinforced bulkhead rating was supposed to be. He walked through it. Not through a hole in it. Through it. I don't have the theoretical physics to explain what I saw on the security feed. The wall was there, and then he was on the other side of it, and the wall was still there. He had come, I believe, because things were not going according to plan. The Convergence's protocol had assumed a window of complete incapacitation. That window had not materialized. His forces were being contained and isolated. His communication network was destroyed, and his bionullifier compound was being metabolized out of effect ahead of schedule, partly because Marcus kept pushing his body physically, which apparently accelerated the metabolization process, and partly because Captain Mays had identified the compound's chemical profile and had been deliberately hyperventilating in clean air sections to flush his system. Which sounds undignified and absolutely worked. Mordrak walked toward the main atrium with the unhurried certainty of something that had been told. It was the most powerful entity in any room it entered. He was not wrong. In terms of raw capacity, measurable and documented, he was the most powerful entity in the Hall of Heroes on that day. Batman intercepted him in Corridor 4. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say intercepted. I do not mean Batman fought Mordrak to a standstill. I mean Batman placed himself in Mordrak's path and then proceeded to make Mordrak deal with him, which is a different thing entirely and in some ways a harder one. The engagement lasted 22 minutes. I know because I was in the maintenance alcove at the Corridor 4 junction for most of it, having arrived there entirely by accident while rerouting around a blocked section, and I could not leave because the path back was compromised, and the path forward was Mordrak. So I stayed in the alcove with my toolkit and watched. Batman did not have a weapon that could hurt Mordrak. He appeared to know this. He was not trying to hurt Mordrak. He was trying to occupy Mordrak's attention, which required him to remain in motion, remain unpredictable, and maintain the engagement without being caught, while the atrium behind him was being cleared of remaining Convergence forces by everyone else. He used the corridor. He used the turns. He used every maintenance alcove and service junction and structural irregularity that I had spent 2 years learning to navigate. He knew that building better than I did. He had studied the schematics, obviously, but there is something else in the way he moved through it. Something that suggested he had walked those corridors in his mind many times before the moment required it of him. Mordrak was never still. His attacks were real and consequential, and several of them connected. I watched Batman absorb impacts that would have ended a normal person and keep moving. I don't know what his suit is rated for. I don't know what his training protocols include. I know what I saw, which is a man in his 40s, running on compromised reaction time with reduced motor function, refusing to stop. He bought 22 minutes. 22 minutes was enough. The Convergence began extracting their remaining forces at the 3-hour 50 mark. Not a rout, exactly. More like a controlled withdrawal from a position that had proven untenable. Mordrak disengaged from the Corridor 4 exchange without apparent urgency, and moved back toward his breach point with the same unhurried quality he had entered with. He did not acknowledge Batman as he went. He did not acknowledge any of them. The last Convergence unit cleared the station at 1814 station time. I know this because the all-clear tone sounded at 1814, and it was the most beautiful sound I had heard since the canary cry, and for entirely different reasons. I found Elias Vane in the main atrium at 1820. He had spent the 4 hours and 11 minutes of the engagement in the atrium, not because he had been unable to move. He had made clear, several times, to the rotating escort of support staff, and one very patient Robin who had briefly joined him, that he was capable of getting himself to a shelter compartment. He had stayed in the atrium because it was where the birthday cake was, and because he had decided, at some point during the proceedings, that if the hall fell, it would not fall while he was hiding in a closet. He was sitting at the folding table when I found him. The cake was intact. Half the candles had been knocked over by the shock waves from various engagements, but the other half were still standing, unlit, in a lopsided arrangement that suggested the number 43 for approximately 1/2 of the years being celebrated. "You made it," he said. "I was in the maintenance crawlspace for most of it," I said. Good place to be. He looked at the table. Cake's still good, I think. I sat down across from him. My hands had stopped shaking, finally, sometime in the last 30 minutes. The toolkit was heavy on my shoulder. I set it on the floor. They found 3 of the dispersal units, I said. I found the other 3. He looked at me. He had very clear eyes, Elia's vein, the kind of eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by things. 3, he said. The nullifier compound. It was in the air system. I found 3 units they missed. I paused. I don't know if it made a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know why I never made it to the fight?" I had wondered about this. The official record notes that Scarlet Cyclone arrived after the engagement was resolved. It notes this without commentary, which I had always thought was more of a kindness than a critique. "My hip," he said, "the prosthetic hip they gave me 15 years ago has a power coupling that the nullifier compound interacts with. I seized up at hour 1, couldn't walk, spent the engagement sitting on the corridor floor." He considered this with an equanimity that took me a moment to recognize as genuine, which meant I was in the same position as you, not in the fight, not useful by the usual measurement. "You were still here," I said. "Yes," he said, "we were both still here." He found the lighter I had left on the table during the setup, the one I had used to test the candle arrangement. He lit the 43 candles that were still standing. They burned small and even in the recycled air. "Make a wish," I said, which was a ridiculous thing to say given the day, but sometimes the ridiculous thing is what comes out. He thought about it for a long moment, really thought about it, which I had not expected. "I already got it," he said finally. "Same one I had when I was young enough to still be fighting." He looked at the candles. "They hold." He blew them out, all 43 in a single breath, which for a 78-year-old man was, in my considered opinion, the most impressive physical feat I witnessed that day. The debrief was 3 days later. I gave my account to 2 Hall intelligence officers and a xenobiologist who was very interested in the dispersal units. The units were taken into evidence. I signed several documents I was not permitted to read in full. Someone official shook my hand. I asked later if the convergence had been stopped permanently, or if stopped was even the right word for what had happened. The answer I received was a variation of the answer I had been trained to expect. The situation was being monitored, additional measures were being implemented, the Hall's security protocols were under review. Which is to say, no, stopped was not the right word, delayed was closer, set back perhaps, made to understand maybe that this particular building was not going to be cleared the way they had planned. I went back to maintenance rotation the following week. The conduit in sublevel 3 needed a full replacement after the battle damage. The environmental scrubbers had to be completely decontaminated, which took 11 days and most of my patience. The junction panels in corridor 4 had to be resealed from scratch because of the thermal damage from Mordrak's passage. I worked through all of it. I know every panel in that building now. Every relay, every conduit, every alcove. They never changed my access code. I've thought about that sometimes in the years since. Whether it was an oversight or whether someone decided, quietly, that a person who spent the worst day in the Hall's history crawling through its walls and pulling bioagent dispersal units out of its air supply had perhaps earned the right to stay. I never asked. I didn't want the question to be answered the wrong way. The last thing I will tell you is this. A week after the engagement, I was running a calibration check on the main atrium's ventilation system, the full diagnostic, the one that takes 4 hours and requires physical access to every vent junction in the room. I was somewhere in the middle of the process, up in the ceiling crawlspace above the atrium's west section, when I heard someone come in below. Batman, alone. No costume, civilian clothes, which I recognized as belonging to one of the Hall's resident roster, though I had never been introduced to the man behind the designation. He didn't know I was there. He walked to the center of the atrium and stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he looked up. Not at me specifically, at the ceiling, at the building, at something in the architecture that I couldn't read from my angle. He said to the empty room, "Good building." And then he left. I finished the calibration and climbed down and went back to work. It was a good building. It held. Not because of what was extraordinary about the people in it, though those things mattered enormously. It held because of what was ordinary, because of 43 candles and a maintenance toolkit and a wrong screw pattern, because an old man refused to hide and a facilities tech remembered how to kill a light, because when the air was poisoned and the powers were fatting, and the Convergence arrived expecting to find empty suits, what they found instead was the people inside the suits, and it turned out those were not the same thing at all. They came back 3 more times in the next decade. They never made it further than the outer hull. We stopped counting after the 3rd. The 4th time, I was the one who found the breach. Not before. 2 days before. I had been running a full hull inspection after an anomalous reading in the outer ring pressure sensors, the kind of reading that maintenance protocols say you log and flag and wait for a second corroborating event before escalating. I did not wait for a second corroborating event. I had learned things in the first engagement that the protocols had not yet been updated to reflect, which was that certain kinds of wrong readings do not announce themselves twice. I found the preliminary installation at breach point 3. Different technology than the first time, the Convergence had adapted, which I had expected. Savannah's work showed up in everything they built, the same fingerprint of economy and precision. The installation was smaller than before, better hidden. The kind of hidden that assumed the person looking would use sensors rather than hands, which was a reasonable assumption for anyone who had not spent years crawling through those walls with a toolkit. I flagged it. I documented everything. I called it in on 3 separate channels until I reached Batman directly, which took 4 minutes and required me to bypass 2 protocol layers. And when I had him on the line, I told him exactly what I had found and exactly where it was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been checking the hull?" "Every 3 weeks," I said, "since the first one." Another pause. "Nobody assigned that to you," he said. "No," I said. He didn't say anything for a long moment. I heard him thinking, or whatever the equivalent is for a man who thinks the way he thinks. "The dispersal units," he said. "The ones you pulled in the first engagement. We found 3 in the debrief accounting. Intel said the nullifier deployment was only partial, which slowed the incapacitation timeline and likely changed the outcome." "Yes," I said. "That was you." "That was me," I said. He said, "What's your name?" I told him. He didn't say thank you. I hadn't expected him to. People like that don't traffic in thank you as a primary currency. It would feel diminishing of something that was worth more than a phrase. Instead, he said, "The hull inspection protocol is being updated. You'll have an official designation and access to the sensor overlay network going forward." "That would help," I said. "It would," he said, and then good catch. He ended the call. I stood in the corridor for a moment with the comm in my hand. Good catch, from Batman. In a building full of people who could stop time and move planets and reshape light itself into whatever form they needed. Good catch. I put the comm away. I picked up my toolkit. I went back to the hull inspection because I had only covered 60% of the outer ring, and the sensors were not going to read themselves. There is a thing that happens to ordinary people who survive extraordinary circumstances, a kind of reclassification. The world, which had a particular shape before, the shape that told you what you were and where you fit and what category your existence occupied, stops having that shape with the same certainty. You have moved through a space where the categories stopped applying, and you cannot entirely go back to the categories afterward. I don't mean this in the way people sometimes mean it. the grand transformation narrative, the ordinary man become extraordinary. That is not what happened to me. I remained a facilities tech. I remained someone who knew conduit runs and access codes and screw patterns. I remained, by every objective measure, the least remarkable person in any room that contained the people I worked alongside. What changed was smaller than that, and I think more durable. I stopped asking permission to care about the building. That sounds small. It felt enormous, the first time I acted on it without waiting to be told. The first hull inspection I ran on my own initiative, with no assigned work order, just a hunch and a set of tools and 2 hours of a rest cycle I could have spent sleeping. I wrote up the findings and filed them in the maintenance log and went to bed and did not tell anyone I had done it. Nobody noticed. No flag, no commendation, no acknowledgement that someone had gone outside their assigned scope. The log entry sat in the system. The second time I did it, I found a microfracture in the outer hull plating that, left unattended, would have compromised the pressure integrity of docking bay 7 within 6 months. I flagged it for repair. The repair was scheduled and completed. The log entry noted, fracture identified via routine maintenance sweep. Routine. It was not routine. I had invented the sweep. But the word routine meant the sweep would become part of the actual routine going forward, which was what I wanted. Not credit. The sweep. That is, I think, the thing that distinguishes ordinary people who stay in extraordinary places from ordinary people who leave. Not bravery, exactly, though there is an element of that. Not ambition. It is a particular stubbornness about the value of small, consistent maintenance in the face of large, intermittent catastrophe. It is the understanding, arrived at through experience, that the catastrophes are not actually the primary event. The primary event is everything you do in the time between them, so that when the next one comes, the building holds. The Hall of Heroes holds. It has held through 4 convergence incursions, 2 structural events, 1 internal security failure, and 1 occasion when the flash misjudged a velocity calculation in the inner corridors and took out 3 structural supports and 30 meters of conduit in a single afternoon. The conduit was mine. He felt terrible about it. I told him it was fine and replaced the whole run in 6 hours and charged the materials to training incident budget, which was the correct budget, and I filed the incident with sufficient technical language that it took 3 months for anyone to cross-reference the repair order with the Flash's training log. He owed me one. I have not called it in. The hall stands. That is the end of the story. Not a dramatic end, not a ringing one. The hall stands. The people in it, powered and ordinary alike, are still there, still doing the work, still arguing about the coffee situation, which I have tried to resolve 4 times and cannot resolve because the huntress takes it black and Zarin prefers something that is technically not coffee at all, and Marcus goes through an amount of caffeinated product per day that strains the supply logistics. Elia's Vane died 2 years after the first engagement. Peacefully, which is the word people use when they mean that someone who had a hard life was given the grace of a quiet end. I was at the service. Most of the hall was. Batman was there in civilian clothes in the back, and he left before the reception, which was entirely consistent with what I knew of him. I thought about what Elias had said at the birthday table, with the 43 candles burning in the recycled air. They hold. The wish he'd already been granted, the same one he'd had when he was young enough to still be fighting. I thought, yes, that is it exactly. Not glory, not invincibility, not the clean version where the capes snap in the wind and the weapons hum and the good guys win, because they were supposed to. Just they hold. The building holds and the people in it hold, and the ones who come for it keep finding out at considerable personal cost that holding is not the same as standing still. Holding is active. Holding requires work. Every junction sealed, every relay checked, every screw installed in the right order and noticed when it isn't. Every hour of ordinary maintenance between the extraordinary days. I still have my access code. I have been assigned 3 additional maintenance zones since the first engagement, and 1 junior tech who I am supposed to be mentoring, and a sensor overlay for the hull inspection protocol that Batman had built into the station system 6 months after the 4th incursion. The overlay is good. I use it, and I also check by hand, because sensors miss the things that only wrong looks wrong to a person who put it there themselves. My junior tech asked me recently why I check twice. Because the second check is the one that matters, I told her. She thought about it. Shouldn't the first check be the one that matters? The first check tells you what the system thinks, I said. The second one tells you what's actually there. She's a good tech. She checks twice now too. The hull holds. That's enough. That is, on reflection, everything. I want to go back to one thing, because I left it incomplete, and it has bothered me in the years since. The canary cry. I said I heard it 7 times during the engagement. That is accurate for the engagement itself. What I did not say, what I have not said to anyone who has asked about that day, is that I heard it an 8th time. After 1821 station time, I was in the main atrium corridor, moving toward the atrium to find Elia's when I passed junction 17 and heard it through the wall. Not the full operational version. Something quieter, not weaponized. Just the sound, brief, like a single note held and then released. I stopped. I did not go around the corner. I don't believe she knew anyone was in the corridor. What I heard through the junction wall was a person sitting on the floor of a corridor they had defended alone for 4 hours alone, degraded, improvising weapons from maintenance parts, holding a section of the building that 3 convergence units had been tasked to clear, and letting something out that was not for anyone else's benefit. Not a cry of victory, not a sob. Something in between. A sound that was the body's honest account of what the previous 4 hours had cost, unperformed, private. I kept walking. Some things are not mine to carry. But I have carried it anyway a little. The sound of someone who had done something extraordinary in private without an audience and had not needed an audience for it to be real. That seems to me the truest description of what I watched that day, in every corridor and junction and crawlspace of the hall. Not the parts that went into the official record, the parts that did not. The Flash metabolizing a bioagent through sheer, bloody-minded physical effort, pushing his body when his body was failing, because stopping was not in the available options. Zarin rationing a diminished resource with the precision of someone who had made it stretch before and would again. No waste, no performance, just the correct amount of force applied to the correct problem. The huntress alone in a corridor with a crossbow, she built herself from spare parts, waiting, patient and prepared, for a threat that did not know she was there. Batman in the dark of Corridor 4, absorbing what he could not stop, moving when moving was the only option remaining, buying minutes for the people behind him because the minutes were needed and he was there. Robin in a supply cart. An old man who would not hide. A facilities tech with a toolkit and 43 candles, and a strong opinion about screw patterns. The Convergence did not understand what they were looking at. I think about this often. They had the research. They had the bioprofiles and the power classifications and the tactical assessments. They had designed their operation around a precise model of what the Hall of Heroes was and what the people in it could do. They had everything except the part that mattered, which is this. The model was of the powers, not the people. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. The powers are the part that gets classified and documented and filed in xenobiological research databases. The people are the part that sits on a corridor floor for 4 hours with a jury-rigged crossbow, or drives a supply cart into an armored enforcement drone, or blows out 43 candles at 78 in a building that just survived something it was not supposed to survive. You can model the power. You cannot model what happens when the power is taken away and the person underneath it decides that this changes nothing. The convergence came 4 times and the hall held 4 times. I do not know if they will come a 5th time. I know what I will do if they do, which is the same thing I have done every week since the first engagement. I will check the hull. I will look for the wrong screws. I will seal the junctions and run the relays and keep the building in the condition required for the people in it to do the things they do. I will not be in the official record. I did not need to be in the official record. The record is the building. The record is the held line and the working conduit, and the 3 dispersal units pulled from the air system before they could do their full damage. The record is they held. The record is we held. I will keep my access code as long as they give it to me. I will check twice. I will teach my junior tech to check twice, and she will teach the one after her, and the building will stand in the space between the extraordinary days, maintained by ordinary hands, and when the next extraordinary day comes, and it will come, because they always come, the building will be ready. That is not glory. That is the work. That is enough. There is one more engagement I have not described, because it is the one that still sits heaviest, and I have been working up to it in the way that you work up to the parts of a story you have rehearsed too many times to tell cleanly. The 3rd incursion, Year 6. The Convergence sent Mordrak alone. Not with a legion, not with breach teams or bio-nullifier protocols or dispersal units. Just Mordrak through the outer hull as though it was not there, alone, at 200 station time when the hall was at minimum staff and most of the roster was on leave or off-site. Present that night, Batman on a liaison rotation, Marcus who was between assignments and using the training facilities, Helena who lived aboard permanently by that point, me on night maintenance shift, and a cadet, new to the hall 6 weeks in, 19 years old, whose name I will not give you because she is still active, and the details of that night are not mine to put on record for her. Mordrak walked through the hull at 200. The breach alarm sounded. I was in sublevel 4 when it happened, running a filter replacement on the atmospheric processing units, and I looked at my maintenance display and saw the breach location and the single contact signature, and I did not move for approximately 5 seconds while my brain updated its working model of the situation. Then I started moving, not toward the breach. I had learned by then the geometry of these events. I moved toward the cadet's quarters. She was already in the corridor when I found her. Suited up, she slept suited apparently, which was either exceptional discipline or anxiety she had not yet learned to manage, and I chose not to speculate which. She had her field kit. She was moving toward the breach. Not yet, I said. She looked at me. Contact at breach 7, I have to. I know, not yet. I fell in beside her. Tell me what you were going to do. Respond to the breach. Provide support. To the breach, where Mordrak is. A pause, yes. Batman and Helena are between you and him. Marcus is coming from the training wing. I kept walking. We were moving away from the breach, which she had noticed. If all 3 of them are not sufficient, you and I walking in the same direction as Mordrak will not change that. Where we are needed is not there. Then where? I took her to the auxiliary power node. The 3rd incursion's preliminary analysis, which I had run after the 2nd, had identified the auxiliary power node as the element the hall could least afford to lose in a single combatant scenario. Remove it and the station's defensive systems drop to 40%. With defensive systems at 40%, a second breach was feasible. With a second breach, the calculus changed entirely. Mordrak knew the building by then. 3 incursions of intelligence collection. He knew the node. He was not, I had concluded, walking toward Junction for this time. He was walking toward Junction 4 in order to be responded to at Junction 4, while something else happened at the power node. I did not know what the something else would be. I knew it would come. I was right. It came at 2:14, 17 minutes after Mordrak's entry. A secondary contact, smaller, not a full war form. A scout class unit, fast and low signature. Exactly the profile that would have slipped through sensor coverage, while every alarm in the building was screaming about the 3-meter sorcerer in the main corridor. It came through Junction 9, which was on the node's east approach. It was moving fast and confident, the way things move when they don't expect to find anyone where they're going. We were there. I will not detail the engagement. I will say that a 19-year-old cadet with 6 weeks of hall training performed without error in a close-quarters contact situation against a target class she had never previously encountered, and that when it was over she was shaking in the way that I had shaken in Corridor 11 6 years before, and I told her that the shaking was correct, that it meant something was working properly, and that it would pass. "How do you know it'll pass?" she said. "Because it did for me," I said, "and I'm significantly less impressive than you." She laughed a little, which was not what I had expected, and I was grateful for it. The power node held. Mordrak withdrew at 2:51. Marcus had taken a hit that put him in the medical bay for 3 days, and Batman's left arm was fractured in 2 places, and Helena did not comment on whatever had happened to her in Corridor 4, but moved more carefully for a week afterward. The official report noted a secondary contact at the power node, neutralized by station personnel. Station personnel. That was the cadet and a maintenance tech. That was 2 people who were not supposed to be there, in a position they had arrived at through inference and patience, holding the peace that needed to be held. The cadet is a full operative now. She has been for 4 years. She does not need me to tell her when to move and when to wait. Last month she ran a hull inspection sweep and found a preliminary installation at breach point 11. She called it in like I taught her. She documented everything like I taught her. She filed the maintenance log entry under * routine sweep like I taught her. Then she came and found me in sublevel 3 where I was running a filter replacement, and she said, "I found something. Thought you should know." "Did you log it?" I said. "Yes." "Then you did the job," I said. She stood there a moment. I could see her working through something. "Is it always going to be like this?" she said. I thought about Elia's vein and 43 candles. I thought about a sound through a corridor wall at 18:21 station time. I thought about Corridor 4 in 22 minutes and a man who did not need thanking because he was already moving. "Yes," I said. "It's always going to be like this. And the fact that it is, the fact that there are people in this building who keep showing up and checking twice and holding what needs to be held, that is not a problem to be solved. That is the answer to the problem." She thought about it. "Okay," she said. She went back to work. I went back to work. The filters needed replacing. The hull needed checking. The building needed the things buildings need to keep standing every day in the ordinary time between the days that are not ordinary. I went back to work. That is all. That is the whole thing. The hull holds.